This morning's panel really takes us back to the reasons why MacArthur initially entered the field, which were our concerns about the way the justice system was responding to kids who were in conflict with the law. Many of you will remember 10, 15 years ago when the kinds of juvenile justice reforms, and I use that term advisedly, resulted in more young people being transferred to the adult criminal court. And the sanctions themselves in the juvenile court became more harsh and punitive. So MacArthur, because of its concern and knowing what it did from its long history of doing research in child and adolescent development, decided to look at the developmental differences between young people and adults and to see what the legal implications of those were. And with that mission in mind, we launched the Research Network on Adolescent Development and Juvenile Justice. So I'm joined here this morning by several of the researchers who participated in that work, and then a colleague who's been using the legal implications of that research in her work with respect to the fair and just treatment of young people in conflict with the law. So let me introduce the panel. We have on my far right Beth Kaufman, who is the professor and Chancellor's Fellow of Psychology and Social Behavior at the University of California, Irvine. We have Marcia Levick, who is the legal director at the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Ed Mulvey, who's the professor of psychiatry and director of law and psychiatry program at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. And Larry Steinberg, distinguished university professor and Laura H. Cornell professor of psychology at Temple University, Pennsylvania. So we purposefully handicapped them by not allowing them to use PowerPoints. So I hope you appreciate that. So I'm going to ask them some questions, and then we've been talking about this topic now for over a decade. And so it'll be an informal exchange among us, and then we're going to reserve some time for all of you to ask some questions before the end of this session. So I'm going to ask Larry the first question, which is, most of the application of research on adolescent developmental immaturity has been used to argue against the harsh treatment of juveniles in the adult system. Are there any implications of this work for the better treatment of young people in the juvenile justice system?
May I have the first PowerPoint, please? Sorry. Well, you know, many of the findings from the MacArthur Network's project on adolescent development are relevant, I think, to how we think about adolescence more broadly and not simply how we think about adolescence in the adult system. So the fact that compared to adults, adolescents are more short-sighted, or they're more susceptible to the influence of peers, or they're still developing and still changing, and therefore, we think, more amenable to treatment. I think all of those facts about adolescence as a developmental period should inform how we treat them regardless of which system they're in. I mean, frankly, given the numbers, I think maybe a disproportionate amount of the discussion that's taken place over the last decade has been about kids in the adult system. The vast majority of kids stay in the juvenile justice system, where many of them don't receive the kinds of services and interventions that we know would benefit them. So I think we can take the same understanding and knowledge about adolescent development that has been used in the Supreme Court cases that Marcia will be talking about, and use that to inform better policy and practice within the juvenile justice system as well. And I think that would point toward a less punitive orientation toward kids who are in the juvenile justice system. It would reaffirm the need for rehabilitation and for taking advantage of the fact that adolescence is a time of tremendous plasticity, not only in brain development, but in social and emotional and cognitive development, and provide the kinds of stimulation and experiences that kids need to develop in a normal way, which will then enable them to make a better transition out of the system back into the community.
So there's been some pushback on the research because, of course, if you look at young people and their ability to drive a car, to vote, to make their own legal decisions, at age 21, where we draw the bright lines between adolescence and adulthood and being responsible. There have been some pushback, for example, in some of the Supreme Court decisions about the flip-flop of the APA on can kids make decisions responsibly or not? What do you see about some of the research? Is it going to reaffirm that? Is it controversial? Has there been some pushback against the research from both cognitive neuroscience and adolescent development?
There has been. I think the pushback takes a couple of different forms. One is, as you reference, the fact that we have different ages for different lines that we draw between kids, and if ostensibly we're using science to draw those lines, how does that lead us to draw different lines for different purposes? And I think the answer, as we've written, and Beth and I, other people have written about this, is that different capacities and capabilities are relevant for different kinds of decisions. So the kinds of capabilities that young people might need to make autonomous medical decisions are not the same that are relevant to our judgments of their criminal responsibility. So to us, it doesn't seem at all problematic to have a lower age for medical decision making than we do for criminal responsibility, because the things that the capacities that are necessary to make informed medical decisions are probably in place by the time people are 15 or 16 years old. But the capacities that are necessary for controlling one's behavior in a criminal context are probably not in place at that age. So that's one type of pushback. A second, which I think is harder to deal with, is this issue of categorical age boundaries versus individualized assessments of individuals. And I think from a scientific point of view, we have to acknowledge that within any chronological age group, there's a lot of variability. We all know people who are 16 and are very, very mature. We also know people who are 23 and are very immature. And how do we deal with those variations in a legal regime that wants to make these bright age categories?
Okay. And with respect to the ways in which the research has been used and what you see as the legal implications, the Supreme Court decisions on the death penalty and life without parole have mostly focused on saying the developmental differences should be recognized. Kids should be retained in the juvenile court, and or they should at least have the possibilities of being considered for parole, shouldn't be subject to those harsh and punitive sentences. Where do you see the legal debate going forward?
Well, I think first of all, it is important to just recognize that the research has been embraced by the Supreme Court. So I think that what we've seen in the Supreme Court's decisions over the last 7 years is that the research and the science has driven the court decision making. And that's pretty extraordinary, I think, in terms of the entire justice world that kids face. When we think about the 4 decisions that the court has decided, of course, 3 of them involved kids in the adult criminal justice system, and they were all sentencing cases. The 4th one was JDB versus North Carolina, which was a case that involved issues of whether or not children would think that they were free to terminate a police interrogation within the context of a middle school. And I highlight JDB because that's the case that, of course, stands out as the one case that really said something about juveniles in the juvenile justice system, the legality of confessions and statements that kids made, driven by the same research that has driven the sentencing decisions, but that forced a different legal analysis in that situation. So I think that there is opportunity. I think that certainly the issue with respect to raising the age is one that I think jumps out at us in terms of how we can at least preserve the juvenile justice system for kids who are under the age of 18. The sentencing decisions from the Supreme Court that are on the extreme end of how kids are treated in the justice system do raise legitimate questions, I think, about how we treat kids in the juvenile justice system, a little bit in terms of disposition, but I think also importantly in terms of conditions of confinement, for example. So I often say in my work that youth status drives legal status, and I think we've seen that, and that the capacities of children have changed their status under the United States Constitution in various provisions. Well, as we've seen the sentencing decisions under the 8th Amendment drive different conclusions for kids, in the adult system, I think that the other piece of the Eighth Amendment, which is about treatment, not just sentencing, but also how we treat individuals when they are incarcerated, should force a similar different analysis for kids, that things that we might tolerate for prisoners, and we tolerate a lot in terms of harsh treatment of prisoners in this country, we should not tolerate on behalf of kids. And I think that we need to be making those kinds of arguments.
So in light of the recent decision in Miller and Jackson, what do you see as the implications as they're playing out now across the country?
Well, I think that we are on the beginning of that conversation and seeing what's happening. Miller came down in June. Most legislatures were not in session, actually. Many of them are not in session year-round. I think that we will see a lot of legislative activity in 2013. The decisions put 28 states in play. We have 2,500 juvenile lifers in this country, 2,100 at least, who we think were actually affected by the decision. There are actually some estimates that that number might be higher. So we are just beginning to tackle some of the most obvious questions from Miller. One of them, of course, is whether the decision was retroactive, a legal decision that's kind of in the weeds of the law, but critical in terms of whether or not these 2,100 individuals will get relief. And there are conflicting decisions out of some intermediate courts across the country. We're waiting on a decision out of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Assuming the decisions are retroactive, there's a lot of play in terms of where states can go. We've had some preliminary legislative activity in Pennsylvania and North Carolina that has been far less than hopeful. If you saw the New York Times editorial last weekend, an acknowledgement that states are still not getting it, that we are imposing sentences that really are virtual life, even if we don't call them life without parole. And so I think that we remain highly punitive, highly retributive, and that I think we need to be using these cases aggressively to try to just literally change the culture and the thought process about how we think about sentencing in this country.
Well, that brings me to the Pathways to Desistance study that was part of the work that the research network supported. And Ed, I'm curious, in light of the Pathways findings, what you see as some of the challenges with respect to how we respond to Miller-Jackson, and what you see as the potential trends now in juvenile justice.
Well, asking about trends in juvenile justice, there's probably as many opinions about that in this room as there are people here at this point. So I can give you part of where I see it going. And just to mention, the Pathways study followed over 1,300 kids from mid-adolescence into early adulthood. So it was a large descriptive study of serious offending kids, because so much of the policy debate is driven by the horrible cases of kids doing serious acts. And it was mainly interested in what are the markers of risk of kids who persist, what are the markers of how much do kids stop. And so you have to have kids offending and doing serious stuff in order for them to desist or stop. So two of my colleagues here are co-investigators on this study. It's not my study, it's a large group of people working on it. I think where it ties in with this, and it gets to Larry's thing about individualized assessment also, is even when you look at these serious kids, you look at the deeper end, the felony offending kids in the system, all of these categorical distinctions we make don't hold up when you look closely at them, at the amount of variability in these kids. They're not all uniformly on the path to crime, and in fact most of them are dropping off as time goes on and committing less crime and committing it less frequently and so on. So I think that plays right into the debate about individualization and thinking about individualization and where it's headed. The couple other things that come up, because this is largely a descriptive study, it's hard to, being a quote-unquote social scientist, drawing the causal effects is always difficult. But one of the things that we've also seen that I think comes back to Marcia and Larry's comments about the use of institutional care, these kids are spending a lot of time in institutional care, and we know it's expensive, but it's stunning. Even the kids who report the lowest level of antisocial activity over years that we follow them are spending like 30% of their time in institutional placement, which just doesn't add up in a whole lot of ways. So I think the research is promoting and supporting a lot of the ideas about why are we running this system the way we're running it. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. When you even look at the serious kids, there's a lot of variability, and the kids who are stopping in many ways are still enmeshed in the system in very expensive ways.
So I know there's a recent National Academy of Sciences National Research Council report that talks about a new frame or a new way of looking at juvenile justice. And I know you were involved in that. Can you give us a few of the highlights or what the conclusions are of the report?
Sure. The NAS report, which I think there's a blurb on here available at the meeting, was a panel put together, as the National Academy of Science does, puts together a panel. And I think it reflects a lot of this research we're talking about here. I think it's largely a kind of a scientific review of much of this research that says, if you take this seriously, one, is it really sound stuff? And if it's really sound stuff, how does it apply to the juvenile justice system? And where I think the interesting point there is that it highlights the idea of the necessity to figure out accountability, because the system is going to have to hold a kid accountable and her family accountable, or communities demand accountability. And I think the challenge highlighted in the report is how do we still maintain a system that holds kids accountable in a constructive way? Because if you take this developmental frame and you say kids grow up as their adolescent capacities in their social context, and when you get involved in juvenile justice, it's a social context, and we impose a social context on an adolescent. We have a responsibility to try to do that in a constructive way. How do you do that? One of the ways that kids learn is to be held accountable. Does the system hold kids accountable in a constructive way? How would they hold kids accountable in a constructive way? You don't have to lock a kid up for 8 or 10 or 12 months to hold them, quote unquote, accountable. So that's the report, I think, takes that notion of development very seriously and says, how would the system reflect that? And it takes many of these ideas and tries to put them into that frame.
So recently the foundation helped launch a study that's going to look at younger and first-time offenders that we're calling the Crossroads Study. So Beth, could you tell us how it differs from Pathways and what you hope to learn from the study?
So as Ed mentioned, the Pathways study focuses on serious adolescent offenders, majority of whom committed felony offenses, who have many of them extensive criminal backgrounds. The Crossroads study is taking a new approach of looking at first-time offenders and their first contact with the system, and also looking at kids on what we call the tipping point. For instance, if you commit murder, you're very likely to be locked up and have a very serious sanction placed in front of you. And if you are truant from school, 99.9% of kids get some sort of diversion or are informally processed in some way. And what do you do with a first-time burglar? How do you handle that kid? Should we lock that kid up and give them a formal sanction and process them through the system and get tough on crime? Or should you divert them and give them an opportunity? Many people think just give them a bad mistake, let's give them a second chance. And there's very little research out there that actually looks at what is the impact on a child if you do get tough on them versus if you give them a second chance. So we're going to follow these kids for the next 3 years. We're going to track them every 6 months and look not only at recidivism, which is what many people in the justice system are interested in, but also at their educational outcomes. Do they finish school? At their mental health. What's the impact of the system on their mental health? Their developmental change. Does the system have an impact on how kids change developmentally? So that's the goal of the Crossroads study, is to really take what we've learned from Pathways and go to the kids who are the first-time offenders and see how they experience the system.
So I know you've been in the field for a while, and interestingly enough, you're having trouble finding enough
We just don't have enough crime.
Since crime has fallen, and the length of the study is longer than we had anticipated, but I know you have some preliminary data. What are you learning?
And please, nobody can quote me on this preliminary data. It's preliminary, as Laurie mentioned. We are almost finished with recruitment, but just crime is down. But one of the things that we have been doing is we have the first 6-month follow-up, and we wanted to see, okay, let's just take a peek. What are we finding so far? Well, here's the thing that's kind of scary. Nothing. There's no difference between being formally processed and informally processed in the first 6 months. We don't see a change in education, in mental health, in developmental change. But what we do find is the kids who were formally processed, if one of the things we do is we have them, so we interview the child, so we get their self-report of their offending. So what are you doing out there? We also get their arrest records from the court. What is the court doing to the child? If the child is self-reporting, we actually see no change in formal versus informal processing on their self-report of offending. But what we are seeing is the kids who are formally processed, they're more likely to be rearrested. Now this is interesting because their behavior isn't different. The kids who are formally versus informally processing, they're doing the same thing. But the kids who went deeper into the system are more likely right now, don't quote me, but more likely right now to be rearrested if they were formally processed, which may suggest that just that monitoring of the system, just being involved deeper into the system, there's something going on there that's then snaring them into the system more and more, and then they're more likely to be rearrested 6 months later.
Well, it would also suggest that having court involvement doesn't necessarily link you to services so that you would stop reoffending.
But exactly. So the further you get, you might not be getting the services you need as you're going further, and that's why we need to really explore what's going on with that.
So Larry or Ed, do you want to comment how this relates to some of the pathways findings?
Well, I think it's interesting, the movement in the front end is diversion, how do we get kids out? We're much more concerned with when you get kids in, how do they get appropriate services and what those services might be. They're kind of two slightly different strategies, in a lot of ways. So I'd be very interesting to see how the processing stuff holds up as these kids go along and what sort of service histories. I can just say that to get to the deep end kids, it's not like getting farther in the system gets you a whole lot more services. I mean, one of the things that we're having trouble assessing the impact of community-based services on felony offending kids because the levels are so low in any given time period, the amount of services they receive. And that I think is a tragedy when you've got kids, many with diagnosable problems, many are going back to the community. It's not like we're locking them up forever. And then we really don't provide that many services to them in the community, at least not that we can document.
The other thing that I'm struck by, and again, it is only 6 months of data, we don't know, but there's a theme, I think, that links the two studies, which is that what the system does to you probably doesn't have much of an effect. That is to say, within pathways, we have difficulty predicting which kids are going to reoffend repetitively and which kids aren't, but I can tell you that among the variables that are useful in predicting, none of them have anything to do with how the system treats them, that is whether they're locked up or not locked up, whether they're in the community or in institutional care. It doesn't seem to matter all that much in terms of their recidivism. The same way here, again, just 6 months, but that's 7 years, but 6 months, whether they're formally processed or diverted, doesn't seem to so far have much of an effect on their self-reported reoffending.
No.
So I think it's interesting to ask, why does the system not have much of an effect on kids' recidivism, given the fact that that's what the system is trying to influence?
I would also add that I think that those preliminary findings confirm that what many of us have seen, that it's the exposure, the ongoing exposure to the formalities of the system. So kids who get arrested, who even if they're on probation and in the community, once they're ensnared by the system, eyes on them. And so what that may not be offending as they might self-report gets captured as either a technical probation violation or a minor offense. One person's acting out normally becomes another person's rearrest because someone is watching them. And I think that that's something that we know happens all the time, and in many respects this confirms that. To what end? It's not making any difference really in their lives, except it will likely make them worse.
And that's what we don't know. We don't know, because right now we're not seeing the make them worse part yet. We aren't seeing any changes in mental health or educational outcome or development, but it is only 6 months, and you shouldn't expect those kinds of changes that early. And that's why following them for 3 years and ultimately looking again at, like Pathways did, that transition to adulthood, going into those adult roles, getting jobs, getting married, making those transitions will be so important. And how did the system either impact or not impact those transitions to adulthood?
So I know that you've been very pleased with the way the recent court decisions have gone and the reliance on scientific research to make the case about how kids are not adults. We've had some interesting conversations about the research and how it can be used or misused. What are your fears about how the science has entered the courtroom, and are there any downsides potentially to what's going forward?
Well, I think that this goes to Larry's point about categorical versus individual distinction. So we have really won the cases so far, I think, by looking at the research and treating it as telling us categorical things about kids. And those categorical characterizations and attributes have given the court room to make very striking and profound decisions about kids' status under the law. I think that for those of us who are in the courtroom every day, how we utilize that research, whether it is the developmental research and as the psychologists up here would acknowledge, maybe the soft side of the research versus the pretty pictures of the brain, I think is quite different. And we benefit, I believe, generally from the broader scan. That the more that we can get judges and stakeholders in the system to recognize the profound categorical differences that exist, certainly between kids and adults. You're right, Larry, obviously. I mean, the research tells us, we all know this, that there will be differences across the board from the 13-year-old to the 14-year-old to the 16-year-old to the 17-year-old. But to the extent that those differences are perceived as fairly general and fairly categorical, I think it can be very effective in our day-to-day advocacy in whatever roles we are, whether we're defenders, prosecutors, legislators, judges. I think that we can take account of that. When you start to dig down and try to make a distinction about an individual child meeting all of those check boxes that the research tells us, we may fail because we may have the very mature 14-year-old. And of course, you may have the very immature 19-year-old who is stuck in the adult system because that's the place where we've drawn the line. So I think it's a challenge about how to most effectively make use of it.
So one of the newly emerging challenges, because of the neuroscience, I think, has to do with what we do with individuals who are 19, 20, in that age range. And I receive calls constantly from defense attorneys who have clients who are 19 or who were 19 at the time that their crime was committed. And their argument is, well, if you're going to argue about this from a scientific basis, and the science is now telling us that brain development continues into the early 20s, maybe even into the mid-20s, shouldn't that affect the way we think about people who are kind of on this cusp? And what do we do about that? Right now, it doesn't seem like much of a winner in terms of legislative strategy, but it could become an interesting issue to watch, I think, as things unfold.
So what can we say about the rehabilitation and treatment of serious offenders and what seems to help?
Well, I think I don't want to get back to...
Or do we just have to wait for them to hit age 24? And
be patient. No, I think there are probably a number of things we're looking at, and the one finding that is kind of a negative finding is that longer institutional stays don't seem to get us much in terms of reduced rearrest past a certain point. I think this notion of individualization and getting to people, if the system's moving that way, that's a real, I mean, we've been down that road before historically, you know, saying everything is an individualization and we all have to treat the kids individually. And that sounds good. It worries me in the sense of where it may open up the law to, you know, brain scans in the courtroom because it's all individualized. And can't you tell me, doctor, you know, whether or not the kid is so immature that he's not culpable at all. And it also opens up the idea of services. If we're going to talk about individualizing stuff, how you hold services accountable for that individualization is probably one of the biggest challenges that's ever faced juvenile justice service systems, is how do we really actually produce on these nice sounding ideas of individualizing services for kids. I mean, just my cynical view is oftentimes we think individualization is good, so we do it for everybody, and we do a fairly lousy job of it as a result. So, you know, if we're going down that path, and I'm you know, in my heart, I think that's a great place to go. There's a lot of challenges there for us ahead, legally, and I think service-wise. It's a very tough thing to do.
so Marcia, what's on your wish list in terms of the kinds of research you'd like to see going forward addressing the differences between kids and adults?
Well, I think that what I see in my work and thinking about kids in the juvenile justice system is that, as I said, I think that even within the boundaries of the juvenile justice system, we by and large remain very punitive. I think that we've seen an interesting arc, or perhaps it's a circle, where we did start in 1899 with this very individualized focus, a therapeutic model about kids in the juvenile justice system and kids being different. We have traveled a very long road and come back to that point, in a sense, where we again are saying kids are different, we're going to treat them differently, and it's more of a therapeutic model, and the except, of course, is that in the example of sex offender registration, many states across the country are imposing lifetime registration on juvenile sex offenders for conduct that isn't just rape. It's much lower level sexual acting out that is not at all unexpected in the context of adolescent development. I think that's one example of where we still have very seriously lost our way about how we think about juveniles within, again, the boundaries of the juvenile justice system. We have seen some move towards harsher sentencing for juveniles. The idea of any kind of mandatory sentencing for juveniles within the juvenile justice system is simply contrary to the kinds of steps that I think we've tried to be making in terms of individualized considerations. So for me, I think that I would like to see the progress that we've made, the acceptance of the research in the context by and large of the adult system, and to figure out ways to start to identify other ways in which we think about juvenile offending, that we recognize it as coming out of a different set of motivations, that the lesser culpability is real, and that there are ways to take that lesser culpability and lesser blameworthiness even within the confines of a juvenile justice system that is admittedly already a discount. It's already providing something less in the adult system, but again, to take it and provide for responses that are developmentally appropriate. I think that's really the next challenge. We get what the front door entry is. Okay, you're coming in, you're less responsible. We haven't quite figured out what those solutions are that reflect and respond to the developmental research so that we can get impacts where we're not saying, actually, whether we do A or B, it doesn't really matter. And sometimes if we do C, we think that was the right thing, but it makes it worse.
Right. So I know that we're funding yet another set of research studies on adolescent development and cognitive neuroscience. Why the additional research? What do you think will be learned from looking at brain images and the like?
Well, I think
You might explain a little bit about what the study
yes. So this is work that's being done within the context of a different MacArthur initiative on neuroscience and the law, and a number of us are involved in a study that tries to connect the dots between the neuroscience and the behavioral science. In the arguments that were made to the Supreme Court in the various cases that Marcia's talked about, there were two paragraphs that weren't really well connected. So one paragraph is, psychological research shows that kids and adults differ in the following ways. And the next paragraph was, and there also is this neuroscience research that shows that kids and adults' brains are different in the following ways. And we think that these things have something to do with each other, but we don't know for sure. So what we're doing now, for the first time, I think, is a large-scale study in which we're administering the same kinds of psychological tests that were used in the psychological research, and doing neuroimaging on the very same people, so that we can, in fact, see if brain differences between individuals who behave differently are correlated in ways that make sense and that can be documented in the same sample. Now, the reason I think that this is important is in a funny way. First, we know, and I say this cynically, that individuals are more persuaded by the neuroscientific evidence than they probably should be. That it seems to carry a lot more weight in the argument than the behavioral science does, and there's no good reason that should be the case. But nevertheless, I think to the extent that we can show that these different aspects of development are connected and go hand in hand, it makes both literatures more compelling to apply to this analysis.
So we haven't thought much or addressed directly. We've been talking about kids in the juvenile justice system. I know a great effort was made to oversample in the pathway studies so there would be enough girls to draw some conclusions. That research has not received as much attention. Can you say something about some of the findings with respect to girls?
One of the things in with the pathway study in girls was first trying to find enough girls. We oversampled and went after every girl possible, and there were only 184 girls in the pathway study. So first, it's very hard to do some of the same types of analyses we've done with the boys as we've done with the girls, given the small sample size. The research that we've done thus far has shown that the girls do have relationships, particularly with boyfriends, that can be harmful or detrimental given the types of relationships they can get into. But right now we have some preliminary data looking at what we call the trajectories or the pathways of their different types of offending. And what we're seeing right now is that they are following very similar trajectories to the boys. You do have a group of girls who do persist in offending. It's a very, very small percentage, but they do exist, and these girls continue to offend throughout their criminal careers from age 14 to age 21. Majority of the girls, however, follow some of the very same patterns of desistance from crime, and most of them do desist, or they have their peak in adolescence and then decline. One of the things that we are trying to distinguish right now is how can you identify which girls are going to persist, which girls are going to desist. We haven't gone as far yet as what we found with the Pathways boys, but those are the types of things that we're trying to better understand, is who are the desisters and who are the persisters, particularly with the girls.
So this brings me to the gaps that we see in the research with respect to adolescent development and offending. Between your own purviews of the research and the work that you've done, the considerations that were raised in the National Academy of Sciences report and the like, what do you see as the gap in terms of our research knowledge related to the juvenile and the criminal justice system?
Well, let me start with what I think where we have been successful. I think that we have now made the case both in the courts and in the national discussion that kids are really different from adults in ways that can be demonstrated scientifically, whether you want to approach it from the neural perspective or the behavioral perspective or the as any parent knows perspective. But I think that's a done deal at this point. It seems to me that the question going forward is, okay, given that, what do we do now? That is, what's the way in which we should treat juveniles if we can all agree that most of them should be kept out of the adult system for all of these reasons? How should we treat them in the juvenile justice system? And I think that the research, to me, there's two types of research questions. One is, how do we best match individual kids with the kinds of services and treatments that they need? And the second is, how do we disseminate the knowledge that already exists? Because a big problem that we identified, as you know, in the network is not that there's an absence of programs or interventions that work, it's just that they're not the ones that jurisdictions are using. And so how do we get that information into the hands of decision makers and practitioners, and how do we influence the use of evidence-based best practices?
And I'd add to that the use of risk assessment, and when you get to this, back to the idea of, yeah, it's great if we can do the right thing for every kid who comes into the system. We'd probably do better working on just those kids who are the highest risk kids and getting them the right services. So if we're going to parse the sample out somehow, let's logically take a lot of what we have found out about assessing kids and screening kids and turn that into actual provision of services, and do they match what the kid needs? Getting that to me is the next big challenge. We made a lot of progress in assessing kids and figuring out what they might need. The question is, can we ever get the system to use that information really systematically?
And can I just add to that, because it's such an important finding from Pathways, that I think that we think that the community is the better context in which we should be helping kids get their lives back in order. But it's the worst context to be in if you want to get services. And so we need to figure out a way, right? I mean, the services are all in the institutions, but that's not where we want our kids to be. And so if we are in agreement that we can better respond to kids by keeping them in the community, how do we get the services out of the institutions and into the community, right?
Marcia?
Yeah, and I wanted to add that I think the done deal that kids are different has been most successful, obviously, at the margins. So we have been able to knock out the most extreme things that we do to kids in this country within the justice system by relying on that kids are different analysis. We've knocked out the most extreme sentences. There's a lot in between. We can step down from life without parole sentences to term of years sentences that can be 100 years, 275 years in a case I know about in Missouri, 50 years. How long is too long? What are the conditions of institutionalization that are too severe? And I think that those are, for me, whether you're working in the juvenile or the adult system with kids, the really challenging questions that lie ahead, because the court has been comfortable in a way drawing bright lines at the extremes of the way in which our system intervenes in kids' lives. Whether or not they've issued 4 decisions in 7 years. I know there are cases right now that are seeking review from the US Supreme Court on some of these myriad of variations on these, what we would still deem extreme sentences. Is the court ready to jump back in the 8th year and say, yeah, we're with you again, let's try this one? I'm honestly not sure. I don't know whether the court is going to feel like they need to take a break. That taking a break will mean that we are going to have lots of kids across the country serving extremely lengthy sentences until we get to the next iteration of this work.
So Beth, what do you see as some of our gaps in our knowledge and understanding that you think are critical to fill?
Well, I think you raised one already, which is girls. Girls are the largest growing population, and for people in the system, I don't need to tell this group that, but I think we know the least about girls. And I do think that we need to spend more time figuring out appropriate treatments, appropriate services, and appropriate responses for girls. Girls are different, and we need to pay attention to those differences. The other piece that I also think is really important is trying to find where the tipping points are. We've started that with pathways, I think, finding that too much incarceration, just once you get to a certain threshold, it doesn't matter anymore. But at the front end of the system, where is the tipping point in terms of processing? Is it, how far do you get ensnared in the system? And finding tipping points, whether it's in the processing or in the incarceration experience, so that you can better design practices to meet and match with research. So those would be the 2 things I really want to focus on.
So we have some time now for some questions.